Here are the rules of the language. Use these or you're wrong. Python. Hey, Matt.
Hey, Mike.
Should we do a controversial podcast this time? Potentially.
No. Yes. Maybe.
Let's possibly do this. I don't know. Welcome to Hacking the Grepson, where we talk about things that are generally not controversial. But this episode, we're flipping the switch. We're flipping the lid. We're going in the other direction. We're going to talk about some stuff that might make you think. Hopefully, will make you think. Today, we're going to talk about problematic tech terminology. Now, Matt, what do we mean by that?
I think mostly what we mean is that there's been an ongoing discussion, and it's been increasing over the last several years, about terms that maybe are outdated in technology. And there's definitely a controversy about changing some of these things. And we may or may not dive into the controversy part, but this is a conversation that is going on within our community, and it's worth talking about. Yeah, that.
Okay, we're going to do that, everybody, on this episode of Hacking the Grepson. Well, why don't we just dive right in tech, thing. I remember there's like a famous quote. There's two major problems in programming: naming things, caching, and off by one errors. And so the first thing, naming things. Yeah. So when you're programming, you got to name things. Like things have labels. You have data, you have memory, you have files. They have to have names so that you can refer to them later, generally. So one of the terms that we want to talk about first is the dichotomy of master versus slave. Now, this is terminology. My first memory of this is hard drives. Hard drives in your PC. There was like a master hard drive, which was essentially your boot drive that your OS ran on, and that when you started up your computer, that's what it went to look for, an operating system stuff, to power your display, your keyboard, your mouse. How are you going to interact with the computer? And then if you had other hard drives, they might be slave hard drives.
Yeah, I mean, it could have been manager employee if they wanted to be PC-ish.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully it's obvious, but I'll point it out just for the sake of the podcast that master and slave has a negative connotation, at least in the English
especially
language.
in the United States.
Especially in the United States. The United States has a storied past with the concept of slavery. And so having your hardware or software have this kind of connotation where there's one thing that is master over something that is a slave can be problematic. And I don't really know why those terms were chosen originally. Do you know, Matt?
I don't know the reason other than they're descriptive and they accurately, especially like the older things like what you're talking about, where you really did have one item like a hard drive or whatever that was the main controller and everything else just didn't function unless that existed. Like I see how that language came about in that scenario. And what year are we in? 2024. So
Yes.
what, 70-ish years ago or whatever, when people were making these decisions, if not longer, the world was a different place, and we didn't necessarily think about the fact that words might have different connotations to different people. But I remember the master slave thing being an issue as far back as like similar to what you were talking about with hard drives. I think it was specifically like motherboard jumpers or something random like that. Possibly even to select hard drives. I don't really remember. Not a hardware guy. But this has been talked about for decades. It really came to a head though, in 2020 during the Black Lives Matter movement. It got brought up again, and I've seen a much stronger push to actually eliminate the use of both of those terms, master and slave.
Hmm.
I think the biggest place I've seen it, or maybe it's just the place that's affected me the most, is Git branching. The main branch in a Git repository, by default, as long as Git's been around, has been master.
Hmm.
And nowadays, we're transitioning it over to main. And there's some technical challenges about that we can talk about in a sec. But I'm wondering what other areas have you seen this terminology used?
Yeah, the Git repo is big. I used to have the job title of webmaster.
Ooh,
Uh,
me too.
yeah, that used to be a thing when the web was young and making websites and working on websites was novel and not necessarily accessible to the majority of people. Also, another term that's, not so much in the tech world, but is masterclass, which is
Oh yeah,
generally, or masterpiece. It's essentially like the best of that thing. It's not just a piece of music; it's a masterpiece of a music or of an artwork or whatever. Um, and I think just the master by itself is a little less like the connotation is has a little less impact than the master slave
yeah,
combination. Like that just really kind of that relationship, especially in America, like you said, is very fraught with peril, and
right,
lots of actual people have been hurt because of that. And so
yeah. Even if a term has a meaning,
yeah.
a known meaning for long periods of time, if people start using it a certain way
Hmm.
and it builds up those connotations, that's what it means now. Literally means figuratively now.
Yeah.
Why? I don't know, but it makes me angry. But it's the truth, and perception is reality in this stupid world we live in. So,
Well, and
so
and and
we
language.
need to think about these things.
Yeah, and language evolves, and language colors the way you think, just like we talked about in our previous episode. And the vocabulary that is available and that is used. I mean, there's the sense of descriptive versus prescriptive when talking about language. Some people believe that you should be prescriptive about it, like here are the rules of the language, use these or you're wrong. Python. um, or descriptive, which is more, wait, how do humans actually use the language? We should model the rules based on what people actually use. And yeah, the connotations of something like master slave are, I think, more important than the rule and the definition, like what the dictionary might say or something like that. And so, but you were mentioning that regardless of whether you think it should change or not, like the technical hurdles that you might have to go through to actually make this change, what would those be?
Yeah. So specifically the change from the main Git branch going from master to main,
Hmm.
right? Which is I've seen this across companies. And I've seen this, I have transitioned companies since 2020, and I was in a somewhat CI related role in both places, at the end of one and the beginning of the other. And so I've been one of the people who has to help make this transition. And it's interesting how many, when you have a long running way of doing something in technology, there's a lot of inertia that gets built up in it. One is just like culturally, right? People get used to saying the master branch. That's
Hmm.
whatever. That's a person problem. I'm not going to talk about that. From a technology perspective, though, there's a lot of code that assumes that your main branch is called master. Uh, that's a bad assumption because maybe you had maybe you're doing something like feature branching, or you can do your own naming convention for this. But that's been certainly problematic. And then if you do have existing Git repositories and you want to migrate from one to the other, you not only have to move to that new branch, but you have to update all of that tooling and make sure it all works. And sometimes those kind of things, you might have a job that runs once a year, that does some cleanup or something, and it makes an assumption that the main branch is master, and now you've got some random issue popping up in the middle of the year that you didn't expect.
Hmm.
We saw the same thing with the Y2K bug, right? This was an assumption that was made that the years, we only need two digits. um, and
He was
didn't
really
bother
gone
to
by then,
code
you know.
for what if that changes.
Yeah.
And so then there's this big scramble to actually make it change. And it has ripples and repercussions that you may not think about. You know, in the case of adding a couple of digits, that had a huge impact on like older systems. In the case of changing names, it should be easier, and our tools should be designed in such a way where it doesn't make assumptions about that, but they still do. We've still got one of our major branches still called master at my current job because, or one of the main repositories still using master because I know how many places are going to use that, and there isn't a good way without saying, okay, everybody stop, no one do anything. We're going to change the name, and then we're going to change all these scripts because there's a bit of a chicken and egg problem there.
Yeah. I feel like at least some of it, like the Y2K thing, it comes from when a lot of computer systems were built, the resources that were available were much less. There was also just
Hmm.
fewer people doing it. So there was fewer people thinking about how to solve these problems. And now in 2024, computers are a part of everybody's life and systems are being created all the time. And so more people to think about, wait, what makes the most sense for the most people now, and not just the super nerdy people coming up with the internet back in the day or something like that.
Well, and that's actually a really good point regarding who came up with most of these names, right? It was a
Yes,
fairly
who?
elite group, fairly elite group of probably older white men,
Yeah,
you know, you know, 70-ish years ago. Probably came up with a lot of these terminologies, and there was nothing intrinsically necessarily wrong with it from their perspective.
right.
But if you don't see things from other people's perspectives, it's easy to do something that's unintentionally hurtful to other people. And
Yeah,
now we know better, and it's time to fix things.
yeah, and I think, Matt, that we both agree that, like, well, I mean, we don't know for sure, but I would assume that, like, when the terminology was first coined for at least the tech world, it wasn't meant, there wasn't malicious intent behind naming it that. It was just something that was in the common parlance at the time, and they weren't really thinking bigger, more globally about. Well, it's funny though, because probably was created by some American old white guy,
Yeah.
and it's not like they weren't aware of the history at that point. But I guess they just didn't think about it. And now that we're
Right.
thinking about it,
It
it's
didn't
maybe
bother them,
right. It
right?
didn't
It didn't
bother
bother
them.
them, and everyone thinks exactly like I do
Right.
because that's how humans approach the world. And now the world is a smaller place because of the internet,
Yeah.
and we know more things.
Yeah. That's a good point. Speaking of which, just not to get it out of the way, but to get it out of the way, just because it is just about as fraught with peril. We also have the terminology between of using colors to represent tech terms. For example,
Mm.
a blacklist versus a whitelist. Now, a blacklist. Well, I'll just name them first: black hat versus white hat, black box versus white box, dark patterns. The first one, blacklist versus whitelist. This is the difference between saying, for example, you might use it in an access list to something. A blacklist is specifically saying, let everybody in except for these
These
people
people.
or these accounts or these, whatever. Whitelist is like, nobody is allowed except for these people. And you could go either way. It depends on the context. You might use one over the other. But the black versus white, obviously this is a much larger discussion that we do not have the
We don't have the expertise. I
expertise.
think would
Yeah.
be a
I was just listening to a podcast about called 60 Songs That Explain the 90s. They're now on episode 117, so they didn't really follow that rule very well, but they just did Michael Jackson's Black or White. I recommend listening to that podcast. That was an interesting podcast. Black hat versus white hat. Black hat is often referred to someone who is doing something in the tech world with negative intent, and white hat is someone positive intent, usually hacking, like breaking into something for a negative reason versus a positive reason.
white hat hackers might work for a company and
Right.
hack themselves to identify security holes,
Right.
as opposed to the black hat is tending to be more malicious. And that one obviously comes out of more of a like the old West, right? People wore black hats or white hats, and the sheriff wore the white hats and things like that.
Oh, I didn't even think about that
Um,
part, but yeah.
yeah, and well, even blacklist and whitelist, like the racial terms white and black actually have originally very little to do with skin color and have to do with the folks on the white list were considered good and the
Mhm.
folks on the black list were considered bad. So you have things like Irish and Italian people being on on the blacklist
Mhm.
a long time ago, and then because of the way that uh, language evolves and the history of this country, uh, those terms came to take on the meanings that we know them of now. And
Mhm.
so that also affects how some of these things uh, came about and and why they maybe are more problematic today than maybe they were in the past.
Yes, that's a good point. So, I mean, we'll let you draw your own conclusions beyond what Matt has just explained, because that I was not aware of that particular history. But there definitely seems to be a black equals exclusion, white equals inclusion pattern to these things. You more open, more information, more positive leaning is the white, and opposite is the black, which is definitely problematic and not true of actual society. Um, and I think the the way that people like to think about them now is sort of like a blocked versus allowed, or
Yep.
a. I mean, I don't know what the new term for black hat versus white hat is, but I'm sure there is one. Do you know?
I haven't heard it if there is. I'm still hearing those terms tossed out.
Yeah. Same with, I mean, I've heard of black box, which tends to refer to a system that is opaque, that you cannot see into. Sort of like the algorithm on a lot of social media platforms is a black box. Only the people who create it know it. I've never actually heard the term white box, but I assume that exists.
Yeah, a white box is the same idea, but you know what's going on inside of it, right?
Right.
You usually this comes up in like architectural design or whatever, software architecture,
Hmm.
where you can treat something as a black box, which means I don't care what's going on inside of it.
Hmm.
But also there's situations where you literally don't have anything else. And that probably comes more out of like a hardware perspective where you've got some like secure piece
Mm.
of hardware and it is literally a black box and you've got what goes in, you know what comes out, but you don't know what's going on inside. A white box, which is a bad name, should be clear box.
Yeah.
If
Or
they
open
if they wanted to
box.
really get yeah, you know what's going on inside. You may or may not care, but you know what's going on inside. So you can make you can do things that where you're making decisions based on knowledge inside of that white box.
Hmm.
Like, oh well, I know that this is where a lot of like uh, hackers do things. Is if you know the internal workings of something,
Hmm.
you can figure out how to break it easier than if you don't. That said, because it's got the white box, everything's open. It's kind of like open source.
Hmm.
It's got that same dichotomy. Um, I think this one probably is less frowned upon from what I've seen, but the connotation is still there. That black versus white. It's part of the larger conversation.
Yeah, if you want to look at this from a kind of more scientific hue related viewpoint, you could say that like, black, the color black is the absence of color, so there's no light. And so it's dark, you can't see it. And white is all the colors and it's very bright and you can see everything. And so that's even without the racial connotation, there's still like a purely scientific way that something like this could keep living on. But because this is language that humans use and humans live in a society and know history and have, awareness, it's, people have come up with less charged terms. Like I said, blacklist, whitelist, you can do disallowed or blocked versus allowed. Black, I mean,
Yeah,
I think we can do open and closed. I mean, that seems a lot less
yeah.
charged.
Opaque and transparent. I
Hmm.
really like for the black box, white box.
Yeah.
I've always found those terms confusing anyway. in particular white box, because you can't see through white any better than you can see through black.
That's true.
Also, from a color theory perspective, if we're talking about additive or subtractive color, if you look at pigments, white paint has nothing in it, whereas black paint has all of it. But light is the opposite. So it's all selection bias on how we're on which way we're choosing.
Yeah. Uh, and just a quick side note, because we're talking about colors. This is one that I have not really run into a lot, but apparently there's some problematic issues with when you have teams and you give your teams color names like red, white, yellow, black. I haven't really run into that. Have you?
No, we usually have team names everywhere I've done things. Even if it's like a temporary thing where like, hey, we're gonna form a couple of groups to discuss and come together with solutions. First thing might be come up with a name. And I think the problem would come in specifically if you had like, yeah, red, white, yellow, black. I think if those were your four teams, people are going to pick up the racial overtones there,
Yeah.
even if they're not intended. But if you had like green, blue, and red, no one's going to think twice about it.
Yeah.
RGB. Even
RGB.
if you had green, blue, red, black, and white, people aren't going to necessarily think about it. It's when you have it narrowed down to just that band of like, hey, these colors are associated with different types of people,
Yeah.
different groups of people. Then maybe you need to think about it. Although again, I think people didn't necessarily think about these in that light when they were coming up with the names. I try to give people grace for their initial thought, but once you know, it's time to change.
Yeah.
I think similar to the colors and the master slave thing, I think the other really big controversial or problematic topic in tech falls on the concept of gender, right? So you see this even in hardware. You've got male plugs versus female plugs, right?
Mhm.
Male plugs go into the female plugs.
Mm-hmm.
Very obvious reason why these terms might come about. But then you also end up with but then there's also like very male centric viewpoints on things, right? You've got man in the middle attacks. You've got man-made things.
Mm-hmm.
And those are, just meaning man to be person, but like that conversation has been slowly shifting over the years. And that's true outside of tech, right? We've got in comedy, you've got a straight man. Well, now we say voice of reason or straight person, right? But even straight has its own connotations.
Mm-hmm.
So voice of reason has taken over. And these things are true. And then we get into some like really bad things gender-wise, where like you've got the mom or girlfriend test.
Oh man.
I think you put that on our list. I'll let you say what that is because I don't want to.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like maybe I've heard this before, but basically the mom/girlfriend test is this tech easy enough for my mom/girlfriend/female companion to use? And, it's essentially a way of saying like, is it dumbed down enough that someone of allegedly less intellect can use it? And
or who are less tech savvy,
or less
right?
tech.
But it's making an assumption that everyone's mom and everyone's girlfriend is not capable of doing those things.
Right.
Now, in college, when I was trying to figure out math, I would often call my mom and talk through problems with her because she didn't understand that math.
Mm-hmm.
But that wasn't because she was a woman. It's because she didn't ever take that math.
Right.
Right. And I found breaking down the problem so that I could explain it to her was a useful thing for myself to be able to understand things.
Yeah.
Right. But that is true for anyone who doesn't understand it. And that's very different than throwing out a term like, girlfriend test, as if it's just a thing that we all know about.
Right. I mean, to give it a little context, I'm assuming, once again, as we've said, a lot of tech, at least that we're aware of, computers, the internet, that kind of stuff, were male-dominated industries in the beginning. And so you get a bunch of guys together, you're more likely to come up with terrible terms like this because they're once again thinking in their own bubble, you know, and they don't really think about how other people might think. But also, just tech in general is so much more widely used by everybody now that
Yeah.
that's just an ancient assumption. And so that's why a term like this might have arisen then, but hopefully has died out. I mean, I'm not sure I've ever heard anybody I know use that or I even read it anywhere, but I mean, I feel like I've seen it at some point in my life.
I think I've heard girlfriend test before, but I
Okay.
don't think I knew what it meant
Yeah.
when I heard it.
Yeah. So yeah, the gender thing definitely coming from, you know, a place of a male dominated society coming up with the terminology, unfortunately. I mean, the male female thing, like the hardware, you know, something that male plugs into something female. I mean, you know, there's a biological reason for that
Yeah.
terminology, but
That's more sex-based terminology than gender-based,
right.
right?
And
It's sexual characteristics.
yeah, no, I'm trying to think like what is the like you know, less charged term, like input output, or I don't even know. I just don't even
I don't
think
know,
of
innie and outie.
I just don't even think of it in terms of like it's a plug and it goes into an outlet or you know, I guess that works.
Yeah. I've never thought about it that way. Yeah, I have. Yeah, you have the plug is the thing that has the prongs, and the
Yes.
outlet is the thing that receives the prongs.
Yes.
That's neither man nor woman, male nor female
Thankfully, this
necessarily.
is not
It's
a visual medium right now
thank
while we're having this
goodness.
conversation.
And then I think the other issue that pops up with the whole gender, especially when you do it along the lines of boy versus girl, man versus woman type thing, is especially when you move further away from sexual characteristics like the male female hardware, and then you get into like actual gender roles where you get things like mom and girlfriend test. That starts to get into the social construct that is gender, and then you have to start thinking about you know non-binary and transgender and agendered folks, and then you're opening up a can of worms that's not necessary to open up. There's no reason for us to gender our software.
Yes, I agree. I think that's the point we're making. That you know we're not trying to make a judgment call on this, but we're just saying that when you use terms that have connotations in the greater society, that you open up a conversation about what you really mean when you name things these way, and there's just no reason to anymore. I mean, we have so many other words there, you know, the English language and other languages have so many words to describe things that there's no reason that we have to use words like these anymore.
Yeah, and I have an example in real life. I know a person, or I've heard of a person that uses the term Nate, like the name Nate, as in short for Nathan, derogatively, because for whatever reason their family did that growing up, and so they just you're being such a Nate right now was a thing, and then they met a person named Nate, and they're like, I didn't ever think about that. Like, right? Like
Wow.
you live in your little bubble, and then
Uh-huh.
it breaks out, and you're like, oh, I think I heard it on a podcast.
I hear a lot of things on podcasts. Yeah. Huh. You know, another one I wanted to talk about that I remember you saying was kind of interesting is, and this is much more of a it's very baked into the language, much like the master Git repo thing. Is the concept of prettify or beautify versus
Mm.
uglify. You may not be aware of it, but several languages and applications and programs and modules and plugins and stuff really like to use the like when you print something to the terminal, and let's say it's a very complex data structure that has a lot like a deeply nested dictionary or object or something, and you don't want it to just print like a typewriter, like, you know, left or right, go down to the next line. You know, you want to give it some structure so that when you look at it on the page, it's easier to understand. And so there's this thing like in Ruby, and actually there's a module in Python too called pretty print or pprint.
Hmm.
And the point of that is to print it in a more quote unquote pretty manner, which really just means easier to grok or easier to understand and parse. But you know, using the pretty is essentially assumes that the other way is ugly or not beautiful, or you know, somehow the appearance of it is negative or lesser, and so you can kind of see how
Well, I
that can be
think, and I think
problematic.
that's exactly the point, right? Is it's not so much that pretty has a meaning, And it's not necessarily that that's the problem. The problem is we're saying pretty is good,
Hmm.
ugly is bad, and we don't necessarily mean that. What we mean, really, like with things like JSON or whatever, printing that out, right, which is the number one thing I I always just search JSON pretty on 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 search engine to so I can paste in some JSON and be like, oh, that's what it looks like. Would be human readable,
Hmm.
right? Machine centric versus human centric is a very different thing. It's aimed at me reading it, is what they mean by prettify more often than not. Or it means conform to my standards of beauty if it's specifically if it's applying code specific code formatting rules.
Yeah. Much like with the gender thing, it kind of opens up a conversation, a can of worms when you use terminology like that. At least it can. I'm not saying it does, but it can. Where you start putting value judgments on things like code when there's really no need to. Yeah, like in JavaScript, there's a JS Beautify, a Pretty Diff, an Uglify JS, even CSS. I actually thought of this because there's a new value for a particular CSS selector in text wrap. So when you have like a block of text, but your container is only so big, obviously the text is not all going to fit on one line and it has to go down to the next line. Well, how it decides to go down to the next line is surprisingly deep. Where you break a word, if you don't break a word, people have different opinions about how text is laid out on a screen and what's easier to read versus not easier to read. And so they're introducing this new text wrap pretty, which I forget exactly what it does, but once again it's like using this charged word that has a meaning to apply to something that is really more of an understanding thing. It makes things easier to understand and parse on a screen in but in a judgmental kind of way, like saying this is better than if I didn't use it. Which, if you use the word term pretty, you
Mhm.
mean like this is pretty. If I don't use it, it's ugly. And I mean that's not true. I mean it's neutral. It's just different. And so yeah, like I don't like to see. I actually had a visceral reaction when I saw that. I was like, no, we don't need to use that word anymore. Like this is a new value, but they're still using the same terminology that, has these potential issues with it. I'm like, why? There's so many other ways you could do it. And so here we are.
Yeah. Just call it formatting.
Right. Format it or it just, I mean, I feel like there's a lot of people who might listen to this and think that, we're being, overly judgmental or overly analytical about some of this stuff. But I think an important point to remember is that, if you've ever read 1984 and you think of, the fact that the language in that Newspeak
Yeah, double plus on good.
was the whole idea was to reduce the number of words, and instead just add prefixes to certain words to change their meaning. So you wouldn't have the word bad, you would only have the word good, and if you wanted to make it bad, you would just say ungood, and you wouldn't have like very, or you wouldn't have like 20 different adjectives you could add to it. You just add plus or double plus. And it seems kind of silly on one hand, but at the same time it's nefarious, I think, because when you reduce the number of words that you can use to express ideas, it changes how you think, and it changes how everybody thinks and how we communicate, and society can be affected by that. So when the words you use to choose to refer to things in tech or anywhere have the same kinds of resonance in society. And so I think that's why it's important to talk about these kinds of things.
Yeah. Interestingly enough, 1984 in Newspeak is probably the same thing people would cite that were against this. They'd say that that's what you're
Mm,
enforcing here.
hmm.
Whereas I think the point you just made is exactly right, which is language affects how you think about things. There's if you look at old text, you'll see that frequently the ocean is described as being like wine colored.
Hmm.
It's because those cultures did not have a term for the word blue,
Hmm.
so they didn't know what blue was.
Yeah.
At least that's the theory. So it's true, right? When you don't have words for things, you can't necessarily put them into conceptual language, which makes it more difficult to talk about, more difficult to think about. But then also, having a word for something means that it's going to have connotations. So it's absolutely worth having conversations about all of these things so that we understand, like, oh, this is problematic because XYZ.
Mm-hmm. Did you want to talk about the well, if we go back to DOS and you try to do a command that doesn't work and you get that old abort, retry, fail message, did you want
Oh,
to
yeah.
approach that one? Because it is it's a little
I
tender.
don't know if I want to, but I will.
Okay, you take that one.
Yeah, so I think this one is an ongoing challenge because the word is heavily charged but has a distinct meaning,
Mhm.
which is abort. Abort means cancel, terminate, end, right? But especially in America, ending a pregnancy
Yes.
is what abortion means to most people. That's when you hear abort, that's what people think
Right.
about. And so that one's really interesting because I run into it all the time. I'm like, I want to abort this process because that's the term for it from a technical perspective. But it has that meaning. And then if you start saying, I'm aborting this, I'm aborting that, then you get closer and closer into that problem of like, do I really want to be bringing, and it's a heated topic, right?
Yes.
Especially in America, it is a politically divisive thing, and there's a lot of opinions, and there's no strong scientific consensus around a lot of the like middle ground of some of it, and so it's contentious. That topic. So the use of that word can then immediately bring that up and cause friction at work,
Mm-hmm.
which is the problem. The my preferred replacement for that term is cancel. The biggest problem I have with that, I can never remember how many L's cancellation has. I think it's two.
Yeah. Cancellation.
Canceling, yeah, but canceling never looks quite right either. But like that's a small price to pay. You can
Yes.
say cancel, retry, fail.
Yeah. Well, and also, like, just as a side note, like, what was the difference between abort and fail? I don't think I ever chose fail ever.
I don't know.
Yeah. Why?
I
Why were there three?
I feel like abort means just stop, just kill it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Retry, obviously restart it. And then I think fail means throw an error code. Like it's not necessarily like don't cancel the thing. Just say yeah, go down the fail path. Um,
Oh.
but I don't know if that's true. Like I view fail in my mind as like the catch block,
Mm-hmm.
and abort as throwing the exception.
Yeah.
But I could be very wrong about that.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. This particular term is very charged, at least in my lifetime. I mean, maybe when it was originally created, it wasn't as politically charged. I don't know. But yeah, I can't remember, but it's been a long time since I've felt like a visceral like ugh every time I see that term.
I was gonna say I looked up the difference between abort and fail because I
Oh,
was curious.
okay.
Um, and it is more or less what I said. Abort terminates the operation, whereas fail sends a message back to the program.
Ah,
So it's a you're completely done, or like,
do something about this.
hey, you need to shut down gracefully. Is the way it's a kill dash 9 versus a kill.
Yeah, but
Um,
I feel like
kill is probably also a terminology that we should take out of.
yeah, yeah. Cancel works, and I
Shut down.
yeah, shut it down. Um, I think there was just one more that I wanted to talk about because we've got a few others on here, but I think the term of cattle versus pets is an interesting one, which kind of actually weirdly, grotesquely dovetails with the last one, which the idea of cattle versus pets is often used to refer to servers or back in the day, you were on a computer, a client, and you connected to a server. Often you were on and we kind of jumped over this one, you were on a dumb terminal, which is a name for a computer that didn't really have any hard drive space or maybe even processing power, but it was your window to the mainframe, which was the server that actually had the program you were running it on and the hard drive space and the compute, all that kind of stuff. And that server probably had like a name and it was set up and it was, cared for because it was big and expensive, and you couldn't just get another one at a moment's notice like you can now with virtual computing and cloud computing. And that would be referred to as a pet now. Whereas when I, for example, want to just test out a particular operating system with a particular programming language and run a program to just see how it runs, I don't have to install that stuff locally. I can just use something like Docker and write a file that says, pull this operating system of this version, install this program, run this script. I type that, I hit enter, I wait, it does it, I get my result, and then that server goes away. That was cattle. I didn't name it. I didn't care for it. It doesn't stay around. It just exists long enough to do a thing and then goes away. Much like cattle, cows in real life are kind of bred and created specifically to either, produce milk or to be killed for their meat. And so there's this thing in the tech world where I mean, it's kind of nuanced, and I'm not really sure exactly how to approach it. But it's sort of like we used to have pets, and now we have cattle. And is that a good or a bad thing? I don't know. What's your take on this, Matt?
I think I think my take is that there's better terms, and I think that's my case in general. For a lot of the, we can come up with better terms. First off, I don't think pets versus cattle is particularly intuitive as to what it
Mhm.
means. Um, Whereas you could just use the words ephemeral and static or permanent or
Yeah, no one
something
will remember how
to
to
get
spell
across this
ephemeral, though. That's the problem.
EPHE.
You
Well,
have to think
MAL.
about it, but you don't have to think about cattle versus pets as much.
I think I actually spelled it wrong. I think I said I think I said ephemeral. But yeah, pets and cattle easier to spell, but I don't think that they're particularly intuitive, and they do imply that it's okay to kill cows, right? Which can be culturally offensive to some groups. It might be, um, it's problematic for like if you're vegan. But I also don't. I just don't think they're particularly descriptive. I think ephemeral is what I would say instead of cattle, and I usually do. It's a. It doesn't matter where it's running. The part that matters is can live anywhere.
Hmm.
And I think this pets versus cattle often comes up. I think specifically around the hardware that is running the
Hmm.
thing, uh, which is why when you mentioned Docker, that's the thing I was going to mention as well. Is Docker would say, "I've got this thing and I can run it anywhere." But when I shut it down, it's back to a given state, and that doesn't really fit pets or cattle in my mind. It's something else entirely.
I think. I mean, I think the
It's clones.
Yeah, I think the potentially bigger problematic thing about it is it's yet again it's changing the way, or it's modeling how we might think about things now, that things are disposable when they didn't used to be. And so
Mm,
we're like spinning up servers willy-nilly to do a thing and then spinning them back down, and it's like the value of an individual server is now close to nil, much like what's happened in like the music industry where streaming has made music a commodity, where like an artist making a song and all that goes into that does not have the same value that it did before, when we treated that kind of thing as more of a pet and less of a cattle. It's part of the machine. It's part of the machine that it's just fuel for the machine. And much like cattle is just fuel for human consumption versus pets, which we would never think about doing that to or treating them that way. So it's I mean, it's hard to make a real judgment on this, mainly because the use of tech in this way is a very different use case than in real life. Because once again, it's all zeros and ones. It's just like, how do you get the zeros and ones or not, and do you give the zeros and ones a name or not, and does that matter? But it's more just like I said. I don't know whether it's influencing society or if this is just modeling society, and whether that's a good or a bad thing is a call that you have to make, I guess.
right. But be aware that there are people who care about these things.
Yes. And I think honestly, like, despite whether it's tech or not, it's still run by humans. until we are AI heads in a jar. Um, and while that is still true, how humans use it and how humans react to it is important. And, if someone says that, hey, you calling this a blacklist versus a block list bothers me, it's important to listen to that. And it's important to, value that judgment because once again, it's being used by humans. But you have to use your own judgment at the time in the context. And I think we just want to make people aware that this is a thing, and it's important to think about. Were there any other ones on this list you wanted to go over, or do you think we covered the gamut?
Yeah, the only other one I was going to talk about, we already talked about. So yeah, no, I don't think
Okay,
so.
yeah, this is just a sampling of the things. You can find many lists online that have other things that are potentially problematic, and I think we just want to say, just think about it. It's important. Listen to people and how they feel because that's important. And and hack the planet. I don't know. uh, I think that wraps up this episode of Hacking the Grepson. If you want to hear more of our episodes, you can go to hackingthegrepson.com. We try to put out an episode once every other week on Wednesday. And until that time, we now return you to your regular scheduled lives already in progress.